I found tampons in my husband's car. I wish he'd been unfaithful to me instead, so our kids wouldn't have had to go through this. I'm a 29-year-old woman who's been with my 30-year-old husband for 7 years, married for 4. I've never had reason to suspect he was unfaithful to me or even remotely dissatisfied. He likes to joke that we're still living the honeymoon phase, but I wouldn't have thought twice about it if it hadn't been for something I found in his car last month. I was buckling our daughter into her car seat, and I noticed something slotted between the cushions. I thought it was just some stray toy or snack wrapper, so I reached down to fish it out, and as my fingers closed around the object, I felt the familiar cylindrical shape of a tampon. I was confused as I pulled it into view, the bright wrapper stark against the upholstery. This wouldn't have been so unusual. I thought it was just some stray toy or snack wrapper, so I reached down to fish it out. As my fingers closed around the object, I felt the familiar cylindrical shape of a tampon. I was confused as I pulled it into view. The bright wrapper was stark against the upholstery. This wouldn't have been so unusual if I hadn't had an IUD that had stopped my period for the past year. I didn't even recognize the wrapper style. It was a brand I never used. It was a small but glaring discrepancy that made my stomach churn. I brought it to my husband's attention later that evening, still holding the offending item like it was evidence. I hadn't had a period for a year, so I didn't even recognize the wrapper style. It was a brand I never used. But there was a small glaring discrepancy that made my stomach churn. I brought it to my husband's attention later that evening, still holding the offending item like it was evidence in a mystery I was desperate to solve. He didn't seem to understand what it was at first, staring at the tampon in my hand with genuine confusion. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked, his brow furrowing. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "I found it in your car, between the cushions, and it's not mine. I haven't had a period in over a year." His face remained blank for a moment longer before he shrugged and said, "It probably belongs to his coworker Fiona." His initial confusion quickly gave way to dismissiveness as he waved off my concerns with a nonchalant explanation, "Probably Fiona's." I hadn't had a period for over a year. I remember his face was blank for a moment, then he realized. He shrugged and said it probably belonged to his work friend Fiona. At first he was confused, but then he just dismissed my concerns with a casual explanation, "Probably Fiona's." He said with a shrug, turning back to his phone, "She must have dropped it when we went out for lunch the other day." I stared at him, waiting for him to understand why this was bothering me, but he didn't. He didn't apologize or show he was concerned. He just dismissed it. It was as if the tampon was no big deal and I was... He said with a shrug, turning back to his phone, "She must have dropped it when we went out for lunch the other day." I stared at him, waiting for him to understand why this was bothering me, but he didn't. He didn't apologize or show he was concerned. He just dismissed it. It was as if the tampon was no big deal and I was overreacting. His indifference felt like a slap in the face, leaving me reeling and questioning everything I thought I knew about our marriage. It's not uncommon for my husband to carpool to lunch with his coworkers, and we're both fairly close to Fiona and her husband. The thought of my husband carpooling with Fiona and her husband had always been a non-issue. They were friends, after all, and it wasn't uncommon for them to share rides to lunch. In fact, we often socialized as couples, spending weekends at each other's houses for barbecues or movie nights. Fiona and I had even bonded over shared experiences like the challenges of balancing work and family life. Our kids played together, while we chatted about everything from the latest office gossip to more personal topics. It made sense considering how often they carpooled. I reassured myself that the tampon could have easily slipped out of Fiona's purse during one of these outings. No big deal, we were trying to balance work and family life. Our kids played together while we chatted about everything from the latest office gossip to more personal topics. It made sense considering how often they carpooled. I told myself that the tampon could have easily slipped out of Fiona's handbag during one of these outings. Maybe it fell out when she was grabbing her phone or wallet, getting jostled around in the process. No big deal, right? It was just one of those little accidents that could happen to anyone. I brushed it off as a harmless mistake, convincing myself there was no need to worry. After all, our friendship with Fiona and her husband was solid, built on years of trust and shared experiences. There was no reason to suspect anything out of the ordinary, so I pushed the unsettling discovery to the back of my mind, determined not to let a small, easily explained incident cause unnecessary drama. I put it out of my mind until we had dinner. A couple of weeks later, I met up with Fiona and her husband. I really wanted to believe my husband, but I just couldn't get over how the tampon had been tucked in the seat and how my husband had seemed to have no regard for it whatsoever. Maybe he was just playing dumb. I don't know. I did something that I now feel kind of crazy for. I pretended there was an emergency and asked Fiona if she had any tampons while we were out together. She handed me one that was almost identical to the one I'd found in our back seat, and I breathed a sigh of relief. So the tampon there was probably the same one here, and there was probably an innocent explanation as, I thought I'd seen the last of the odd items of feminine hygiene products until I found another tampon this morning, this time in my sock drawer. I feel physically ill at the thought of my husband having an affair, and even more nauseated at the thought. I was pretty grossed out when I found a tampon in my sock drawer this morning. I can't help but wonder if my husband's coworker left them out for me to find. I mean, why would she give herself away like that? The other night, she even offered me one. Usually, I'd want to talk to my husband about this kind of thing, but I feel too sick and embarrassed to bring it up. I've been thinking about the tampons I found in the back seat and the sock drawer, and how they might have got there. I'm wondering if it was my husband's coworker, because she might have left them out for me to find. I'd like to talk to my husband about it, but I feel too sick and embarrassed to approach him with what I found. I've been thinking about everything that's happened with my personal health recently, but I wanted to share an update. Shortly after posting here, I told my sister what happened. The tampon in the back seat and the sock drawer, my husband's cluelessness, the tampon from Fiona, and all the things I suspected. I didn't want to believe it that we compared tampons, save for the back seat one I had already thrown out, and they were a match, just in different absorbences that I hadn't left either in a place where my husband or daughters would have found them and moved them around. My daughters didn't know what they were or where they had come from. I didn't want to believe we'd found the same tampons in the back seat, but they were a match in terms of absorbency. I hadn't left either in a place where my husband or daughters would have found them and moved them around. My daughters didn't know what they were or where they'd come from. My sister was convinced it was Fiona, either picking my husband or picking with me, or both. She still thought that asking either of them directly was a bad idea, so she suggested inviting Fiona and her husband over for our Labor Day barbecue. Unfortunately, they already had plans. My sister and I agreed that it was too soon for cameras without any other evidence, so it was just a waiting game. We watched my husband for any changed behavior, but there was none. We checked our house for any misplaced foreign items, but there were none. We even checked with the girls for any new friends they might have met, but my sister's husband was adamant on this last point. He thought tampons were harmless because he didn't think anything was going on at home. He said it would be impossible to keep it from me and the girls, since it was my husband who took them to and from daycare and most other activities during the week. I felt quite good. I felt a bit better knowing that it wasn't until my youngest daughter Tio got sick last week that I felt any differently. I wanted to be the one home taking care of her, but my husband insisted that I stay at work while he stayed home with her, and I was okay with that. My sister and her husband figured it out. I was glad that he'd agreed to take time off at a moment's notice. At that point, we were all already beginning to put the tampon fiasco behind us. By the third or fourth day, I was just happy to see a child who was almost healthy and a husband who was helping her through it. Towards the end of that week, though, I came down with something. But then when I got home, I found something strange. The toddler that I'd left in an old PJ set was now dressed in a onesie I'd never seen before, with a tiny clip in her hair. I don't remember everything, but I've got a pretty good idea of what my kids wear most days, especially what kinds of clothes. I was surprised to see that the toddler I'd left in an old PJ set that morning was now wearing a onesie I'd never seen before, with a tiny clip in her hair. I can't say I have the sharpest memory, but I have a pretty good sense of what my kids wear on a day-to-day basis, particularly what kinds of clothes they wear. I'd sworn off the full-length sleep suits with snaps across the front long before we had our second child. The long snaps are just a pain and a no-go for efficient nappy changes. I just wouldn't dress her in them, and my husband knows as much. He doesn't plan for or He doesn't buy or accessorize with girls' clothes, so I was amazed and a bit freaked out at the thought of someone being around our sick child without me knowing that. I didn't think twice and went straight to my husband to ask if anyone had been over to see him or the girls. He seemed confused like before and asked. I was confused and upset at the thought of someone being around our sick child without me knowing. I didn't think twice and went straight to my husband to ask if anyone had been over to see him or the girls. He seemed confused like before and asked me why I would think that it had just been him and the kids all day. I asked him again if someone had stopped by to say hello, and he denied it. He told me to calm down. I might have lashed out and come forward with the accusations right then and there, but our older daughter was in the room and she sensed something was up. In a calmer voice, I asked him a third time if anyone had been around our children, and my husband swore that the girls hadn't been around anyone but him. He also denied buying new clothes or doing anyone's hair. With our daughter in the room, I was all over the place with emotions, so I decided to leave it. I couldn't make sense of it then, and I can't make sense of it now, even after driving myself half crazy with explanations that don't add up. After nearly losing my mind over a hair clip and a onesie, I realized I wasn't getting anywhere with the accusations and the half-baked guesswork I got so absorbed in. I was so paranoid and miserable about the situation that I wasn't sleeping, eating, or looking after my kids properly. I wasn't getting any answers, so I decided to install hidden cameras at my sister's house with my brother-in-law's help. But before the cameras were delivered, I finally got the confirmation I'd been waiting for. The day started like any other weekday morning in our busy household. My husband and I rushed around trying to get our two energetic daughters into their school uniforms, all while trying to grab a quick bite to eat ourselves. Despite the chaos, there was a sense of camaraderie in the air, as if we were all in this hectic dance together. Once the girls were dropped off at school, my husband and I went about our respective workdays, counting down the hours until we could reunite with our little ones. But I couldn't shake this strange feeling, no matter how hard I tried, and it only got worse when I got a notification on my phone while I was at work. I saw that the front doorbell was ringing, so I clicked on the video clip, half expecting to see the usual delivery person or neighbor passing by. But what I saw left me speechless. I was pretty freaked out. I couldn't stop thinking about it, and it only got worse when I got a notification on my phone while I was at work. I saw that a young woman had been to my house and was leading my daughter into the house, hand in hand, with my husband and the other daughter close behind them. My heart was beating really fast as I watched, and I was trying to work out what was going on. The girls were supposed to be in daycare, and my husband was at work. The woman, as far as I knew, was living 2 states away with a court order keeping her there. Yet here she was in our home with my husband and children. A wave of panic washed over me as I tried to make sense of it. Was this some kind of mistake, a misunderstanding, or was there something more sinister? I felt sick to my stomach as I thought about what the answers might be. I stared at the screen, couldn't believe it. I could barely think as I watched it play out. There it was on the footage captured by our Ring doorbell. Was a scene straight out of a nightmare. A woman I hadn't seen in years leading my youngest daughter into our home, hand in hand with my husband and older daughter, trailing behind them. The shock of the moment rendered me momentarily speechless. How could this be happening? The girls were supposed to be at daycare and my husband at work, yet here they were entering our house with a woman I never thought I'd see again. My sister -law.my initial reaction was one of sheer disbelief, a desperate hope that there must be some kind of mistake, some innocent explanation for what I was witnessing. But as the reality of the situation set in, I was at daycare with my kids and my husband was at work when they turned up at our house with my sister-in-law. I couldn't believe it at first and was hoping it was all some kind of mistake, but as I saw what was going on, I got really angry. I felt like a tidal wave of anger was going to hit everything in its path. I was shaking and went to get my phone. I was really worried and needed to know what was going on. But as I was calling my husband there, I got really angry when I found out. I felt like I wanted to know what the woman was doing in our house, so I called my husband to ask him. He didn't answer, so I texted him. Even though he's not the brightest, he probably realized he'd messed up by going through the front door. He knew I'd got the ring notification and wanted to delay the inevitable. I didn't get any response, so I called my husband straight away to ask what the woman was doing in our house. He didn't answer, so I texted him. Even though he's not the brightest, he must have realized he'd messed up by going through the front door. He knew I'd got the ring notification and wanted to delay the inevitable. By the fifth or sixth call, though, he did pick up. The woman on the camera was my husband's sister, as I found out later. She was probably the source of the tampons, the onesie and the bow. She's also registered as someone with a history of abuse and a recovering addict who spent the after years of not hearing from her. I was amazed when she turned up at our house with our kids. I hadn't seen or heard from her in years, and from what my husband said about her, I didn't expect I ever would. But there she was. She'd been coercing the silence of another one of my husband's family members after she had abused them. She's also registered as an individual with a history of abuse and a recovering addict who spent the better part of her adolescence and young adulthood coercing the silence of another one of my husband's family members. I was shocked to see her after so long, but even more so when I realized what her presence meant. My sister-in-law, who'd just been in rehab, was the last person I expected to come back like this, especially with so much going on. I was pretty shocked to see her after so long, and even more so when I realized what it meant. My sister-in-law, who'd just been to rehab, was the last person I expected to come back into our lives like that, especially when it was all so secret. It was a real wake-up call. This wasn't just about a random tampon or a bit of carelessness. It was about deception and betrayal at the deepest level. I was livid, to say the least. It wasn't an affair, but it was still disgusting to know who it was and why all this had been happening. I was absolutely furious. It wasn't just about a random tampon or something harmless. It was about deception and betrayal. I couldn't believe it. It wasn't an affair, but it was still disgusting. I found out who it was and why it was happening. Apparently, my sister-in-law wanted to reconnect with people she'd hurt, and my husband was high on that list. I could see the irony in her attempts at reconciliation through deceit and intrusion. My husband didn't want me to know about it, or worse, try to keep her family and our children away from her. So they'd been meeting in secret, often at our house. When I was at work, they would enter through the garage in my husband's car, so the Ring camera at the front door wouldn't tip me off. The level of planning and secrecy involved made my skin crawl. She spent the night on a weekend I had been on a business trip, and she slept in our bed. The very thought of her in our home, in our bed, made me feel violated. She babysat our girls on a night. My husband told me he had dropped them off at his parents'. The casual way he had lied to me, the ease with which he had kept this secret, made me question everything I thought I knew about him. She bought the girls' clothes and dressed my youngest in the onesie and bow that my husband had promised. In his life, I had dressed her in myself. The image of my daughter in that unfamiliar outfit, a tiny clip in her hair, now felt like a haunting reminder of the betrayal that had been unfolding right under my nose. But when I asked my husband for reassurance, for any glimmer of hope in the face of uncertainty, all I found was disbelief and denial. He brushed off my concerns with a casual shrug, insisting that it was all in my head, that I was overreacting to a series of harmless coincidences. My husband swore this was all. In my head, the tampons, the onesie, the bow, and all the rest. He was perfectly content to watch me agonize for weeks over a woman he insisted didn't exist, shrugging off each progressively more unsettling discovery like it was news to him and telling me I was being irrational. He insinuated that I was experiencing postpartum depression 2 years after I'd given birth. 4 years later, I told him that one of my biggest fears for motherhood was to suffer from PPD like my mother had with me, to not be fully present for our babies and be left with a world of guilt and regret as they grew older. But as the weeks stretched into months went by and I still didn't know what was going on, my patience were wearing thin, and I was getting really angry inside. How could he just dismiss my concerns like that? How could he make me doubt my own sanity? He said he was going to help, but he just stood by and watched our family fall apart. He told me I wasn't sleeping enough, that I missed the girls too much, that I needed to take a step back and reevaluate my mental health, that I gave him the benefit of the doubt because he was my husband and because no other version of events made sense. Now, after a month of this mind puck, I have nothing to show for I trusted him, but this whole situation has made me really angry. He didn't explain himself when he was confronted. He stammered and stumbled over his words, making up half-arsed excuses that made no sense. He muttered something about trying to protect me from unnecessary stress, and that his sister just wanted to make amends. But his words were all over the place and not very believable. Each excuse was more far-fetched than the last, and it was obvious he was trying to cover something up. He was being really evasive, and it made me think that the man I had trusted and built a life with was now a stranger to me. He was hiding behind a front of lies and deceit. I watched as he avoided. He was avoiding eye contact, shoulders slumped, and it was obvious he'd done something wrong. There was no way he could keep lying and not look like a complete idiot. I knew there had to be a reasonable explanation for what he'd done, but there wasn't. Every time he said something, I could see he was panicking. He looked like he was in a really bad place, like he didn't know what to do or how to feel. I could tell he was worried, but he didn't say anything. Sometimes when he didn't say anything, it was obvious that something was wrong. I knew then that I couldn't stay with someone who had so obviously betrayed my trust and put our kids in danger. I couldn't bear the thought of my daughters being exposed to such toxic secrecy and manipulation. I had to prioritize their well-being, and that meant making the hardest decision of my life. I told him it was over, and he looked shocked and desperate, but I couldn't feel sorry for him. I'd had to walk away, determined to protect my kids from any more harm. I decided to end the relationship and file for divorce, which was both heartbreaking and empowering. It was devastating to acknowledge that our 7-year journey together had come to such a bitter end, but it was also, I felt like I had to do that to protect my kids from any more hurt. I decided to end the relationship and file for divorce. It was really hard to accept that our 7-year journey had come to such a sad end, but it was also great to take control of my life and make my own well-being and that of my children my priority. The divorce process was long and tiring. Every step felt like a new battle in an endless war. There were so many court sessions, each more exhausting than the last, where I had to relive the pain and betrayal over and over again. My husband fought me every step of the way, refusing to accept responsibility for his actions and trying to paint himself as the victim. His determination to contest every detail made the process even more exhausting and emotionally taxing. In court, I detailed the discovery of the tampons, the hidden meetings, with my sister-in-law and the lies my husband had told to cover his tracks. I showed the video footage of her entering our home with my kids. I also gave evidence from my sister and brother-in-law to back up what I was saying. But the court needed more than just assumptions about my sister-in-law's character. They needed concrete evidence of her past and present behavior, which was tricky to get hold of. I stuck to the bigger picture and emphasized my husband's deceit and the breach of trust, which were undeniable. The court recognized the complexity of the situation and the emotional turmoil it had caused. After months of legal battles and countless court sessions, the court ruled in my favor. I was granted primary custody of our daughters, with my husband receiving supervised visitation rights. The judge acknowledged the need for. I stuck to my guns and made it clear to the court that my husband had definitely broken the trust. After months of legal battles and loads of court sessions, the court finally got it. The situation was complex and the emotional impact on us had been huge. In the end, the court ruled in my favor and I got primary custody of our daughters, with my husband getting visitation rights, but only if he could show he could be a stable parent. Looking back, this whole thing taught me a lot. I hope others can learn from it too. Trust is the foundation of any relationship, and once it's broken, it's really hard to rebuild. Always trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Communication is key. Address issues head-on rather than letting them fester. So, when you're thinking about the deceit and risks involved, it's important to consider that this was a stable environment for the children. I learned a lot from the experience, and I hope others can too. Trust is the foundation of any relationship, and once it's broken, it's really hard to rebuild. If something feels off, it probably is. Communication is key. Talk about issues instead of letting them fester. Most importantly, never settle for less than you deserve. My children and I deserve a life free from deception and betrayal, and I'm committed to building that future for us. What do you think about this story? Please leave your comment below to let me know. Thanks for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around you.